and challenges that communities face addressing state policies that affect them. So with no further ado, I'd like to begin talking about why is state policy so important? And it's a very simple proposition. States rule. There's a concept in law that probably many of you are familiar with known as Dillon's rule. And basically it holds that since cities, towns, villages, counties, and so forth don't exist as far as the US Constitution is concerned, they are considered what are called creatures of the state. What that means is that in the United States, a state government can basically do anything it wants with respect to local government, as long as it falls within the purview of the US Constitution. And that's known as Dillon's rule. Now, fortunately for most cities around the country, most states have modified that somewhat over time. Two that haven't are North Carolina and Virginia, which still basically follow Dillon's rule quite strictly. But in most other states, you have what's known as some kind of home rule provision. So for example, a state constitution or a state statute will typically say that cities have some degree of flexibility to take actions that have not been explicitly permitted by the state, as long as they haven't been forbidden by the state. And the reason that's important is, on the one hand, it's very powerful. So for example, in New Jersey, most cities have rent control ordinances, which are permitted because the state has not prohibited it. And the state courts have upheld this. However, if tomorrow the state legislature decided to ban rent control, all of those ordinances would become invalid immediately. And what we've been seeing very much in the last 10 years or so is a practice of what's known as preemption. So especially there are quite a few states that are red at the state level, but have blue cities in them. And it's become almost routine in some states that when a city enacts some ordinance that the state legislature doesn't particularly care for, they immediately pass a law to prohibit the city from enacting that ordinance. So Austin, Texas passed a city ordinance banning discrimination against source of income, meaning against people with vouchers. The Texas legislature immediately passed a law saying you couldn't do that. A couple of cities of all places, North Dakota, passed ordinances creating family leave provisions. The state legislature passed a law saying that municipalities were not authorized to do so. There are literally hundreds of similar examples around the country. The other thing that's particularly important about states is not only do they have the power to determine the legal framework of what cities can and cannot do, they also have the power to determine the fiscal framework. So Ohio municipalities actually are fairly fortunate that the state allows them to have both an income tax and a sales tax, as well as a property tax. So they have a variety of fiscal resources, some of which are more cyclical, others more counter-cyclical. New Jersey, on the other hand, municipalities may not have either an income tax or a sales tax. In other states, it could be one or the other. Some states have many states nowadays have caps on property taxes. So as we know, in California, Prop 13 created a 1% cap, and the quality of public education in California has been steadily slipping since they did that. So all of these mean that when you try to do something at the local level in terms of changing the conditions in your town, or city. You can only do that within the framework that your state allows. And so the ability to first understand what the state allows and doesn't allow, understand what flexibility a municipality may have within that, and then third, to understand how to go about getting changes in state laws that affect municipalities should be absolutely top of the agenda for anybody seriously working to foster revitalization and regeneration in their cities. So within that context, I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about what revitalization means and some of the framework for that. I think the first point is that when we talk about equitable urban revitalization, which is a basic framework, that has kind of three pieces to it. Urban, and at first level, does state policy support cities in ways that level the playing field between cities, suburbs, and rural areas? As far as revitalization is concerned, does state policy support cities' efforts to become stronger, more vital communities? Or is state policy basically limited to what you might call urban subsistence, which is providing the minimum so the city survives? And then, and this is something that I think it's critically important to think about, is the question of equity. And in that context, given that we operate in a politically, racially, and economically unequal society, and given that I think our policies, we would like to see them try to change some of that. The question is, do state policies reinforce existing racial and economic inequities, or do they encourage or even mandate actions to try to reverse inequity? So I think when you look at your state policies in your city or county or wherever you're working, I think it's important to look at those three basic questions. Does state policy level the playing field? Does state policy actively further revitalization? And does state policy address inequity and try to redress it? Or does it reinforce it? And that should become the starting point for how you think about changing state policy. The other thing I'd like to mention is that when we talk about revitalization, there's a tendency to think, at least at a threshold level, that we're talking about physical development or economic development. And that's part of it, but it really goes well beyond that. I think the first area, I would say, is that a municipality has to have a decent fiscal and service delivery capacity. And that again hinges very much on the state's fiscal rules. So in some states where municipalities can only depend on the property tax, that unless the state provides enough aid to redistribute resources and level the playing field, those cities are going to be at an inherent disadvantage in their ability to compete with others or to simply provide the services their citizens need. Secondly, is a competitive economy. Can the city build its economy? Does the state offer the tools that it needs to that end? Third, again, is a healthy real estate market. Fourth, however, healthy neighborhoods and a decent quality of life, because inevitably, unless a city can provide decent neighborhoods, can provide areas where people actually want to live, good schools, good parks, safety, and so forth, their revitalization is going to be hindered. And then finally, relating to schools. Does the municipality, does your city provide the type of educational, workforce development, employment, and other opportunities that enable individuals living in that city to maximize their human capital? So all of those pieces are directly relevant to urban revitalization. And again, as you sort of scan what you're trying to accomplish vis-a-vis what the state permits you to do, all of those should be on the table. And again, if the goal is to do this in an equitable fashion, that has to be intentionally built in. It is not simply going to happen. So the key things, key ways in which states affect local action, I would say at least three key points. First is where state policies or state laws simply prevent or discourage local action that can be taken in terms of furthering revitalization. So for example, in many states, the ability of a municipality to deal with problem properties or to use tax foreclosure as a more constructive process is hindered by state law. Tax foreclosure, for example, is one area where the state regulates exactly what cities, or in some cases counties, can and cannot do, down to the last smallest detail. So in some states, a municipality has virtually no ability to get properties through tax foreclosure. In others, they can. Another example, and it was interesting, there was a piece in, I think, yesterday's New York Times about the frustrations that people in Minneapolis have had since George Floyd's murder in terms of the ability to actually get the police force to change its modus operandi. And the article pointed out that one of the reasons that the police department was able to, in many cases, ignore the instructions coming down from the mayor is that they had state laws that made it possible for them to do so. In New Jersey, we have a thing called the Police Chief's Bill of Rights, which means that if a mayor, for example, instructed a police chief to start foot patrols or community policing in neighborhoods, and the chief thought that was a bad idea, the chief would be within his or her rights to refuse. So blocking and discouraging local action is one area. A second area is making it difficult for the local action to be equitable. So for example, many states ban or discourage in different ways inclusionary zoning. Other states use, for example, the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, that's run for low-income housing tax credits in ways that tend to concentrate those projects in concentrated poverty and racially impacted areas. All of these are, again, state policy areas. And then finally, as I mentioned before, by limiting the resources available to municipalities through the taxation policies, through state aid. Believe it or not, there are at least a few states in the United States that are more generous in providing state education aid to high income than to low income school districts. And then just simply by not providing support and discretionary funds for localities to institute good strategies. Conversely, they can provide very positive tools. They can provide tools that help municipalities address problem properties like vacant property receivership or spotlight eminent domain. They can provide fiscal tools like historic tax credits or tax credits to piggyback on top of low-income tax credits projects and so forth. So the state can be a positive actor and very supportive of urban revitalization. But at the same time, it can be a problem. And I think it's critically important that anybody working in this space. Appreciate this, and more than appreciate it, figure out how you, either in your city, in coalitions with others, working through organizations like Greater Ohio Policy Center and others, can start influencing state policy in ways that will make it more effective as a tool for urban revitalization rather than as a barrier to revitalization. And on that note, I'd like to switch over to Allison, who will actually describe some of the ways in which Greater Ohio Policy Center has been involved in efforts to change state policy in key areas. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Alan. And again, I so appreciate the PFR that you've written and the outline and sort of summary you just provided. And then, of course, appreciate today's invitation. So thank you. So I am Allison Goebel. I am the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. Just briefly, we are a state research and policy advocacy organization with a focus on Ohio's legacy cities of all sizes. So we're a nonprofit. I have a bipartisan board and staff. And for purposes of this conversation, it might be helpful for you to know that of our 8 staffers, 3 of us are registered lobbyists. And at least in Ohio, to be sort of, a good player in the advocacy field, you do need to be registered with the state. So I'm going to tell 2 different stories that I think offer 2 different different sets of lessons around advocacy and sort of state policy and how it plays out on the ground. So the first story I want to talk about is getting the land bank legislation passed in Ohio 12 to 14 years ago. And then the other story I want to talk about is restarting state grant funding for Brownfield remediation. And I know that there's some Ohioans here in the audience. So if I get anything wrong, chime in chat and we'll do a corner, corrections corner. So in terms of the land bank, I just want to stay upfront that I joined Greater Ohio in 2010. So I may get some of the early history details a little off. Again, if you know the details better, please chime in. But so in 2006, 2007, GOPC, my organization, along with a coalition of advocates, most notably Jim Rackauckus, were excited by Dan Kildee's ideas around land banking. And so the coalition started moving very quickly to persuade, at that time, our Democratic governor and Democratic House. Our Senate was still Republican, has been Republican for years and continues, but tried to start persuading state policymakers to establish a statewide authorizing language that would allow counties across the state to incorporate county land banks. At first, the coalition strategy was to ask for the land banking powers to be accessible to just like a smaller portion of our 88 counties, so about a third, and it would be the most populous counties in the state. The legislation also smartly specified a funding source that could be used for operations. Didn't mandate it, but said that this was an eligible source of funding. So at the time, again, this is like 2006, 2007, realtors and small real estate investors were opposed to the language, but the coalition was able to persuade, like I said, the Democratic governor and Democratic House. In the end, Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is, got authorizing language first in 2008. And again, I want to tip my hat to Jim Rackauckus and his leadership in that. The legislature, from what I understand, and basically what I have seen since then in my own time, was much more comfortable with doing a pilot before letting this untested tool or just like run rampant statewide, right? So then in 2010, the coalition that Greater Ohio had been part of, and then that was made up of other local government officials and sort of other advocates. The legislature granted authority to our 44 most populous counties. And then in 2015, the other all 88 counties at that point were then permitted to create county land banks if they wanted them. During this time period in 2012, our Attorney General was persuaded, again, by Jim Rackauckus in large part, to create a $75 million demolition program, which was funded with proceeds from a robo-signing mortgage settlement. And a lot of other states at that time used that money to plug budget holes. Again, Jim and others made the case successfully that that money really should be used for demolition. And in the program language that just, kind of outlined how the money would be allocated statewide and also how to apply for the competitive portion of the funding. The Attorney General specified, if you have a county land bank, we are going to run the money through the county land bank first. And if you don't have one, then we'll run through the commissioners. But that was the final feather that pushed a lot of counties to create land banks. So we saw a big push in 2012. A lot of land banks got incorporated, again, really to access those dollars and to at least on the local level, really create a home for coordination of those funds. Then in 2014, advocates persuaded the feds and our state housing finance agency to allocate a portion of the post-recession hardest hit funds, again, for demolition. And in that program, eventually the counties with land banks were prioritized for competitive funding. And so again, sort of at the advocates that were encouraging state level policymakers to prioritize county land banks and utilize these federal dollars, right, to really kind of help get them up and running and accomplishing their missions. So 4 lessons that we at GOPC keep as fundamentals when we're advocating for state policy change, which I think the land bank sort of arc really helps exemplify. So the first is piloting a new state policy or program in one geography or smaller set of geographies really can get policymakers comfortable, especially as Alan was sort of outlining, like, are we wanting to push proactive revitalization, pro-equity policies, that it may not always be received well, depending on what your state legislature looks like. And so potentially a pilot, right, might be able to kind of get your foot in the door and then help you kind of open that door further in the future. The second lesson is giving the abilities to give the ability to locals to opt in or opt out of the policy. Now, this may be more reflective of sort of like the culture in Ohio than maybe necessarily a good sort of national lesson, but I will say that in Ohio, if the legislation from the beginning had said all counties must create county land banks, the County Commissioners Association, I think, would have been opposed. There would have been a lot of opposition. As of today, not all counties in Ohio have land banks. And so just that ability to choose to use this tool or not, I mean, eventually we at Greater Ohio and others, I think, want to see every county have a county land bank. But again, sort of that glide path towards compliance, at least here in Ohio, has been a more productive way to accomplish policy change than sort of a big hammer coming down. Third, identifying a clear source of dedicated funding for the policy or program that is being advocated for, right? And building it into the legislation has been huge. And we, Greater Ohio, basically, this is the only way that we like to really advocate for policy recommendations, is if we can say, and this is where you're going to get the money. Because every single question that we get from policymakers is, that's nice, how much is this going to cost? And where are you going to get the money? And who are you taking that money away from? So I'm just sort of saying, noting this, that that is boilerplate every meeting that we have with policymakers. That is the question. So if you are thinking about your own advocacy work, doing that legwork and research ahead of time will be worthwhile and show that you're, a serious advocate. Fourth, the land bank story. Again, I want to acknowledge the great work that local advocates did and the very savvy ways that they helped accelerate the adoption of land banks in the state. Persuading state agencies and leaders to program federal dollars for these goals, I think, helped, right? Because I think for state policymakers, they saw it as free money, right? It was not money out of the state coffers that they were programming. It was the federal dollars, at least in those two early programs. And that, with the opportunities that ARPA presents today, I think there's still opportunities in a lot of states to be, sort of in the mix and helping to program those dollars. Again, on other federal dollars, of course, right? But those two opportunities just couldn't have come at a better time in the evolution of land bank creation here in Ohio. So the other story I want to talk about is Brownfield remediation funding, which has been a key issue of my organization almost from its founding, and certainly since I took over in 2016. So in the early and mid 2000s, Ohio had an awesome brownfield remediation grant program, which went away in 2013 for lots of reasons. We don't need to get into them today, just to say that program went away, right? We tried to stop the program's demise, as did local governments and private sector folks. And nonprofits, but efforts weren't well organized. The private sector was sort of out in front and they looked a little self-serving. And anyway, it went away. So when I took over in 2016, I told my board, look, brownfields funding was a top priority. This is a huge barrier for, economic development, community development, the location of brownfields of where they are, disproportionately impact poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Like brownfields needed to be a key priority for us, and that we were going to lead the advocacy parade in Ohio. So I added brownfield expertise and connections to my board. And on their advice, we changed our messaging to, we want regulatory reform and funding reforms. And so our message of like, hey, please policymakers, please reform these regulations first. That's not going to cost you a thing. It should increase redevelopment. Then we can talk about funding. That played well with our legislature and administrative officials. They could see the potential for redevelopment. They also liked the fact that we weren't asking for money. We were also, in Ohio's case, asking basically for Ohio to come in line with federal guidelines, federal regulations. So like, it was sort of like, why hasn't this happened before? Let's do it now. And I realized that in a lot of other places, that's maybe you're not going to have such a slam dunk. But my government affairs director, starting in 2017, talked about brownfield regulatory reform and grant funding, right? And basically every policy meeting that he was in. I hired also at that same time a project manager whose job was to build up and nurture a multi-sector coalition. And over the last 5 years, he has built up a lot of trust and cachet with brownfield stakeholders around the state, but particularly in the private sector. And I'm talking about like the environmental consultants, lawyers, bankers, some developers. And at least in Ohio, that's a fairly significant win. We don't see a ton of private and nonprofit partnerships on an issue. So we don't take it for granted. We are actively nurturing that partnership, but just sort of wanting to acknowledge that the buy-in and active participation of private sector folks has been really important to us in this work. So in 2017, we did get the regulatory reforms enacted. It was great. That has a long story. I'm not going to share all the pieces, but I am going to say that we were really, really close to getting the legislation over the final finish line, and it stalled. And so we called one of the lawyers that are part of this orbit, and we asked them to use their fancy lobbyist to get the language unstuck, and they did. So again, this is a moment where we are very cognizant of not pulling on the private sector too much, but that we want to make sure that they know what's going on and that we can then pull, kind of ask for these favors at the key points that we need to. So after the regulatory reform passes in 2021, we're asking for funding through the state operating budget. Again, there's lots of twists and turns there. But at the 11th hour, right before the state budget's about to pass, excuse me, $350 million was allocated to brownfields. And this money came out of an additional unexpected $3 billion in tax receipt revenue that the state had underestimated. So state legislators had all this play money and they were like, okay, let's kick it to brownfields. So the program that was created, excuse me, the program that was created allocated a base of $1 million to each county and then left the rest of the money up for first come, first serve. So we're really grateful for that funding and grateful that no matter your capacity, your county is eligible for funds. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So we have concerns about the first come, first serve provision, but overall, we're happy that we have some money at least back flowing in Ohio. So, oops. Okay, sorry. Oops. Sorry about that. So some of the four lessons from the brownfields that I want to share: build a diverse coalition, ask for regulatory reform that aligns with policymakers' goals, prepare for opportunity, right? The $350 million from the $3 billion was an unexpected windfall, and don't look a gift horse in the mouth. Now, this is not exactly, this program may not be distributing funds as equitably as we'd like around the state, but we think it's a good first step. And we're confident that the oversubscription in applications is going to give us the basis that we need to advocate for a more robust long-term program in the future. So I'll stop there, answer questions. And Alan, I'm looking forward to our conversation. Oop, Alan, I think you're still on mute.
Hey, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. You know, I'm convinced that if there's one phrase that will go down in history from the pandemic era, it's "you're on mute." Okay, but I'd like to mention, by the way, this publication, which is one of the two that Justin flagged at the beginning of the session, in addition to having a lot of very specific nuts and bolts stuff about specific areas like receivership and vacant property registration and so forth, also has an appendix which goes through a lot of the kinds of things that Allison was talking about in terms of the whole area of legislative strategy. And I'll just mention one point because I think this is important. Ohio has a Republican legislature and a Republican governor. A lot of these issues are not core red, blue partisan issues. You know, you can be a governor, you can be a Republican legislator from some small town or rural area, and you're getting calls all the time from your constituents about what are we supposed to do about that vacant factory, you know, across the street from the school or whatever. So things, a lot of the issues that cities are trying to grapple with can become bipartisan issues and can have success in a Republican legislature. Obviously, that's not true of all issues. But one of the key things in terms of successful advocacy that I learned a long time ago, and I think Allison has certainly learned, is you don't go for what you ideally want. You go for what you can get. And I think that's a basic principle. And
Alan, we talk about achieving incremental wins instead of spectacular failures. I mean,
yeah. I mean, there are people in this line of work, and I'm sure we all know some of them, or perhaps some of you are them, who would rather go down in flames gloriously than, you know, eke out some incremental wins through compromise and negotiation and coalition building. But in the end, except for perhaps gratifying some egos, that doesn't do anything for the people we're trying to help and we're trying to enable live better lives. So I think that's the ultimate test. Are we doing something that can enable people to live better lives? And just one other point, and then is some of the points Allison also make very clear. The devil is in the details. It's not about getting a, quote, a receivership law, say, passed by the legislature. It's what kind of receivership law, what the provisions of that are, that is going to determine whether it's a real asset for cities trying to deal with problem properties. And the same is true whether it's tax foreclosure, whether it's taking, whether it's brownfields, whether it's land banks. I mean, Ohio's land bank program today is vastly ahead of where it would have been had it not been for the success in getting a dedicated funding source built into the legislation. So the devil is in the details is another important lesson. Well,
100% agree.
Great. Shall we go to questions? Are there questions? Justin?
Yes. So first, I just want to remind everybody that if you do have a question, please feel free to submit it into the Q&A box and we will pose it to our speakers. The first question I wanted to ask from the box refers to the idea of cities focusing on a specific block or a neighborhood. And, you know, while we always, a lot of times we advocate for, hey, you want to really focus on an area and bring that area forward. it can be seen by folks who may not be as in the know as gentrification. They want to know what kind of ways we can combat that idea that, focusing on lifting up those neighborhoods, one by one, that we have the ability to do that activity in is a negative.
Okay. Well, I'll start. First, I certainly agree. I think it is critically important to have a targeted strategy. If you spend your money, as somebody or other once said, spread across the city like peanut butter, you're not likely to accomplish much of anything. So, but at the same time, I agree completely. The term gentrification has become a buzzword for almost anything that can happen in a city today. And it's constantly raised by people who are either opposed to change or fearful about change, or in many cases, rightly, feel that government is not necessarily acting in their interests. And so they are inherently suspicious. So I think the critical thing, if you're going to develop a targeted strategy, an effective one, is you have to lay the groundwork. You have to start by sort of doing a lot of outreach, explaining what you're trying to do, working with people, working with neighborhoods, helping to not just identify a neighborhood and then decide from a top-down standpoint what should happen in that neighborhood, but actually work with the people in that neighborhood so that what they want and what they feel they need can be reflected in the strategy. And I think that's the only way to actually build a basis for a successful targeted strategy, is to build trust and build relationship and engagement. Because given the kind of baked in level of suspicion and hostility that exists in many communities today, without that kind of process, the specter of gentrification is raised, rightly or wrongly, and then the issue becomes a political issue, a confrontational issue, and you can't succeed. So that would be my main suggestion. But don't give up on the idea. Oh, and one other point. Targeted strategies never mean that you're going to ignore or neglect the neighborhoods that are not part of the strategy. That is another recipe for failure. If you start to say, we're going to put all our resources in these areas, and these areas we're basically going to ignore, you can be sure that that will backfire.
I'm just re-looking at, Alan, I 100% agree with everything you said. I think, and also I just want to, Justin, who asked the question, your question about sort of how to combat sort of accusations, rightly or wrongly, of gentrification. I would just say sort of the response depends on the stakeholder group, because if it's residents, then I think what Alan talked about is, yeah, absolutely. I will also say in our experience, which is of course just an N of one here, but in our experience, residents are actually pretty happy to start getting development and, attention, right? Because they have felt so neglected for so many years. So that the criticism, the loudest, most hand-wringing criticism often is coming from armchair critics. Now, not always, right? But so a response to an armchair critic who's complaining in the chat function, of the local newspaper, is a very different audience and requires a different sort of response or no response versus residents, right, who may have very legitimate concerns about loss of, displacement, whether it's cultural or physical. So I guess I would just also I would just say you're not going to please everyone. So the armchair critics, I think, should be fairly low on your list.
Great.
I have a question, and I'll start with you, Allison, since you were talking about building coalitions in Ohio, but both of you should feel free to answer. And it is, how do you bring resident leaders into these state policy coalitions and really ensure that their voices are at the center and they have consequential power to really help shape the coalition and the goals of the coalition moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question and an important one. So we are a small organization, but we rely extensively on coalition building. And in that coalition are often members who have membership organization, are often the membership organizations that at the state level represent local entities, whether there's no nonprofits or churches or other organizations. So we get feedback that way, but that's not the only way. I mean, we have our own relationships where we are going out and we are talking to the folks that we know on the ground, getting their input and inviting them into to provide on that, I mean, sort of in that development process, to provide feedback, to provide, to make sure that we are not, that there's not unintended consequences being created, right? And that they're able to spot that before we roll out. The way that Greater Ohio operates, and this is sort of advice that we've gotten over the years from lots of others, is that we don't introduce a bill unless we think it can get passed, right? And so part of that passage, of course, is at the State House, but also we want to make sure that whatever pieces of legislation we're championing are going to be ones that then are useful and net productive at the local level. So, the question of how do you do that? I think it depends a little bit on how the organization is built, but certainly if you are ignoring those voices and not providing access, right? So my email is everywhere. My office number is everywhere. Whenever we go out into communities and we're talking, we're meeting with folks, we are not the experts on how this is going to play out on the ground. And so I drill into my staff here a real respect for what we're going to hear on the ground. And like I said, kind of create an ongoing advisory, whether it's formal or informal, to help inform the work that we're doing as policy development, as a policy organization, making recommendations.
Great. Let me add one point to that, and then pick up on one of the questions in the Q&A that is kind of a follow-on to what we were talking about. First, just very quickly, I think Allison's point about don't get a bill in unless it has a real serious shot of getting passed. Some people, again, who don't understand, think that getting a bill introduced is the key goal. Generally speaking, I don't know about the ratio in Ohio, but in New Jersey, the ratio between bills introduced and bills passed runs about 15 or 20 to 1.
Yeah, it's probably like 30 to 1 in Ohio.
Okay. So anybody who can make any noise at all can find a legislator who will introduce a bill on their behalf, if only to shut them up. It's a waste of time, waste of effort. Focus, again, on the ones that have a real shot of winning. You may win, you may not. You never know for sure. But don't waste your time unless you think there's a real shot. And this, I'd like to pick up on the comments by Ashley Johnson about gentrification, because I think this is an important clarification. I don't think either of us are saying that gentrification, in the classic sense of people being displaced as more affluent people move in and prices skyrocket, is not a problem. The problem comes when you have efforts to improve a neighborhood, improve the quality of life and conditions of life in that neighborhood for the people who live in the neighborhood, but which gets derailed because people start claiming that this is somehow a cover for gentrification, or it's a form of gentrification or something like that. And I think it's really critical to distinguish between the two. If we, as a community, start raising the gentrification flag every time a serious effort is being made to improve conditions for people in a neighborhood, we are not going to get very far. So we have to distinguish between the legitimate suspicion of gentrification and really watch very closely the signs where that's happening and then figure out how to deal with that constructively, versus the gentrification as a slogan rather than a serious issue. So I think that's the distinction. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And just quickly, since I've got it up here, to Chris, the question is, do you think having a lobbyist is essential to advancing any statewide legislation? Okay, Allison may disagree with me, but I would say absolutely not. It can help in particular situations, depending on relationships with legislators, the skills of that lobbyist, the nature of the issue, it can help. But it is not, in my opinion, a fundamental starting point if you can build the coalition and have people who are savvy and sophisticated and will have relationships with legislators in your coalition. But so you have to look at that almost as it's an option, but it's not an inherent starting point.
I'll just say on that question, I do think you need a lobbyist, but I also think you and the partners involved need to have all of your homework done. You have to do it all. The lobbyist is only a key that is opening doors that you otherwise cannot open, particularly if you're hiring a contract lobbyist. Now, my government affairs director, my lobbyist on staff, the three of us, I mean, it's a little different, right? Because like we're working for a mission-driven organization, moving our mission. But this, at least in Ohio, the legislature and administration are so relationship driven that sometimes you have to have that door open. But again, a lobbyist, particularly a contract lobbyist, is probably not going to do all the work that you need to get done ahead of time.
Yeah. And again, relationships are the critical thing. But one thing you can look at, and this is where in New Jersey, I helped organize a coalition, this goes back some years, to get laws having to do with vacant and problem properties. We were quite successful. But a key to that was the fact that we had a lot of very strong local members who had relationships with individual legislators in their districts. And that's what really started opening the doors for us. But one way or another, those relationships are critical. Okay. Justin?
So this will likely be our last question. This is from Gail, and they write that they work in a city in Indiana, and the city is often blamed or asked to fix things that need to be resolved at the state level. How can they direct people and educate them to get to the right folks and get the right sort of efforts and be talking to the right people to make a difference?
So I will say we run into this a lot, or we see this happen a lot. There's some really basic things. So like your call center folks need to make sure that your call center folks need to be able to accurately direct people who are calling with complaints, right? So like they need to be able to say, you need to call Congressman so-and-so, or you need to call a state legislator so-and-so, and here's the phone number. Creating or establishing community meetings, right? So if there's this perennial issue that the city's getting charged with being responsible for, but maybe this is a state issue. This is where if you as the city can arrange a neighborhood meeting where the state legislator comes in, for example, right? Like that helps to kind of, again, more physically sort of help people see the connections up between the issue and what's going on, and sort of the responsible level of government for that. It's hard though. I mean, it is definitely hard. Alan, did you have any suggestions?
Again, I think I was somewhat distracted. I was sending a message to one of the other questions, follow-up thing here. I think the big issue is, let me go back to that specific question, is you just have to explain how things work, how government works to people. I think people naturally tend to look to local government for fixes. They call up the city, there's a problem, they call up the city. And obviously cities have to do what they can to try to fix a problem. But at the same time, you have to use that as an opportunity to help people understand how the different layers of government and the different division of responsibilities and everything actually works.
Gail, I'll just say, I know of one city here in Ohio that for several years had a standing agreement with the local paper, and the city wrote a weekly or biweekly column and so produced, original content for the local paper, which was struggling, but it also ended up being a platform where the city could sort of do that education effort, right? By saying like, this week's column, we've been hearing a lot of complaints about blah, 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 right? This is what the city's doing, but this is really a state issue. This is why we can't do everything that we want to. This is where we're, anyway, so it became one platform for them, or at least one way for them to do that. Now, that requires staff resources to produce that type of column on a biweekly basis, but they felt it was one effective way to handle, sort of try to mitigate some of those misconceptions.
So I think we may have time for one more. And this question is referring to some new legislation coming through the pipe that, deals with infrastructure and jobs. They are curious to know what recommendations you all have for leveraging new investment and new funding for different types of reinvestment in infrastructure and other projects.
Okay, I will just start by saying, number one, it's a great opportunity. There's some amazing resources coming down through the infrastructure program and conceivably in the future through other programs. So that's a big question mark. But certainly the infrastructure program alone can provide amazing resources. And what's, I think, exciting is that even though it's hardly guaranteed, there's at least some effort has gone into the thinking by the administration of the infrastructure program to see that it is used in ways that foster racial and economic justice in the communities. That said, I'd say the single most important thing is to bear in mind that an awful lot of this money is going to be competitive money rather than formula money, which means that anybody in a city who is interested in this has, number one, got to really familiarize themselves with the ground rules, the criteria, the funding criteria, the resource levels, et cetera, and then find the ability to put together, on usually in a fairly tight timetable, the kinds of documents, the kind of proposals, the kind of plans, the kind of strategies that are likely to get funding. Because one of the things that worries me a lot about these programs is that the money is going to end up going disproportionately to big cities, wealthier areas, and so forth, that have those capacities already, and not to a lot of the smaller cities and areas that desperately need the resources. So I would say the key thing is start right away, if you haven't already, building your capacity to compete for funds.
I would agree with that. A lot of the IIJA money is also going to flow through states or be administered by states. And so this is where not only do you need to have your own house in order at the local level in your application, but you need to be doing ongoing education with the state agency. In Ohio, a lot of this money is going to go through Department of Transportation. And so we and others are doing a lot of education to try to explain, this is money that has a lot of opportunity, but you can't just sort of plug it into existing programs, which, by the way, are not very equitable or, helpful from a sustainability component side. So just sort of don't forget also about the state as an intermediary for some of those federal funds.
Absolutely.
And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap. I do want to say thank you to our speakers, Alan and Allison, for really giving us a great discussion of the different sort of approaches and thoughts that communities should take and keep in mind when pursuing state policy. I also want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. Please visit our website for more information on upcoming webinars and resources related to revitalization. And I hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.